While the web has created opportunity, given marginalized groups a voice and made our daily lives easier, it has also created opportunity for abuse, given a voice to those who spread hatred, and made all kinds of crime easier to commit. It would be defeatist and unimaginative to assume that the web as we know it can't be changed for the better in the next 30 years. If we give up on building a better web now, then the web will not have failed us. We will have failed the web.
So Tim, welcome to In Conversation.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
When you created the web 30 years ago, you thought it was going to be a force for good, didn't you? But it doesn't feel that way now, does it?
Well, over the arc of the web, from the original creation, originally to start with, it was supposed to be a neutral platform where humanity could be humanity. And humanity, I would explain to people patiently, could be good and bad, so you will see good and bad. And then there was a time when it seemed that actually some of the more utopian ideas were becoming justified, in that the blogosphere was working, and people found that they added their little bit. They blogged about their own speciality, and they linked carefully to other blogs that they liked. And as a result, they found that the total value of the web seemed to be growing out of all proportion. And so then we talked about this thing called the long tail, the fact that most of the value is actually small people, medium-sized people. And
who wouldn't normally have been heard.
Who wouldn't have been
These
heard.
Minority voices.
And they said, yes, when you look at the web, most of the activity is not the big companies, it's only the small people. And so during the blogosphere, it seemed that if you connect people up and you take away the national boundaries and you just leave humanity connected, it will naturally become better. It will naturally produce goodness. So now here we are 30 years on, and we don't have a long tail anymore.
And we also now see that it's not just the minority voices, the small persons talking about their interesting things that they care about, but it's also terrorists who talk about things they consider interesting, and white supremacists, or even pedophiles. So that wasn't something that you'd envisaged.
Well, and in fact, when you look at what's happening now on the web, so the question isn't just can everybody have their say, no matter whether they're nasty or nice. The question is, do particular social media sites, because of the way they design, do they in fact lead to a constructive conversation? Or do some sites naturally leave? Do they bring out the worst in people? Or do they bring out the best? Well, they bring out both. But it's possible you could argue that things like Twitter, they seem to get people.
So you've brought up Twitter. So are Twitter doing it wrong? Do they amplify the bad aspects?
No, they certainly do amplify the bad aspects. I think there's some interesting research, but it's not obvious. By sitting at Twitter, of course, you can sit down and follow the people you follow and find that it's a wonderful place. And I think when some of the elections around the world in 2016, people were shocked about their lack of knowledge of what other people thought. One question is, does it amplify good, does it amplify bad? And another question is, does it drive people into polarized camps? And certainly America now seems to be more polarized than ever before. Britain seems to be very polarized. So maybe that polarization could be rolled back if the social media sites were redesigned.
How? So how do they need to be redesigned? What does Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter, what does he need to do that he's not doing now?
Well, what I've suggested to Mark Zuckerberg that he should do,
at Facebook, yes.
For example, one thing that occurred to me is suppose they change the way they introduce you to friends. At the moment, they say, hey, welcome to Facebook. By the way, you have 100 friends. Why not these 100, why not 101, 102? Why don't you join these people as friends? Because they know all of your friends already. You'll like them. So how about instead saying, well, you've got 100 friends on Facebook. How about this week, we'd like you to meet somebody who's very like you, but they live in an Arabic country. We want to stretch you talking to somebody of a different religion. We want to stretch you with somebody who's different. They're just like you, but actually follow a different football team and so on. So could we design these social networks so that they introduce a little bit more of a challenge to people, but they end up perhaps being very rewarding and allowing people to end up seeing the other side of the argument, understanding how the other cultures live.
But Facebook is not a social enterprise. It's listed on the stock exchange. They're there to make money. They're not there to make people kinder or nicer. So it's quite possible that Mrs. Zuckerberg could turn around and say, well, that's very sweet, but we're not there to stretch people. We're there to give them what they're interested in.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg has written a whole bunch of blogs saying that Facebook's purpose is to, very much in the flavor of, I want people to be able to solve the big problems on Facebook. I want people to be able to be connected and to be able to do good things for some value of good. So now we've got this sort of vicious circle working where the ad system is in fact training people to lie.
You've talked about three big problems that the web has. And one of them you've said is that this ad-based revenue skews things. What is the other possibility, though, if it's not by ads that they earn their money?
Well, there's lots of different things going on here. When people are doing it for money, then things change. Then you get people like the people in Venice, Macedonia, the kids who famously may have affected the Trump election, who certainly got a lot of ad revenue. Their websites were only aimed at getting money, and
it's
so
manipulating
the
the
ad
system.
machine. Well, the ad machine was training them.
Yes.
This is, if you want to get more money, this is what you do. And they found things like Hillary Clinton always wanted Trump to win, or something, as a headline. Wow, that got lots of money. So they learned to do that. So the ad system is. So now we've got this sort of vicious circle working where the ad system is in fact training people to lie. So
how do we stop that? So where does the obligation lie? Does it lie with Facebook, with Google, that they have to stop having an ad-driven system? And what's the alternative?
Well, the contract for the Web, the Web Foundation, is a thing that the Web Foundation has come up with. It's really a vehicle for talking about these questions. The reason why we've got people together is that governments have to do some things and companies have to do some other things.
What about the fact that so much of this is crossing borders? It isn't just one country, and legislation in one country would actually just not solve the problem. All of this is taking place across borders. How do we deal with that?
Well, all those discussions happen with governments, but not within a particular jurisdiction. Governments have to talk to each other, of course. That's part of it. On the technical side, open standards mean that all of your web browsers talk the same HTML language, and so they can all go to the same websites. On the policy side, it's better if you can have discussion between governments. It's hard because you bring the national culture, and national culture about free speech in Germany and in the US is coming from a very different place. So governments need to work together. That's one of the things that is the job of a government, is to work with other governments. It's hard work, but very valuable.
But how are you going to convince Facebook, Mr. Zuckerberg, or all the people who run Google that they should give up their extremely lucrative ad revenues?
I think that people in all of these companies are aware of the issues. Some of them acutely aware. So to a certain extent, if they...
But being aware doesn't mean they'll do anything.
For example, Mark Zuckerberg has said that if he can make Facebook into a more pro-human platform, even if it involves cutting the revenue, that he will be prepared to do that. He said that as a matter of principle. So I think that, and also when,
that actually contradicts the fact that he's listed on the stock exchange. because he's supposed to profit
That's,
maximize for his stockholders.
Always think that's changing, actually, because there has been so much, the people are so aghast at what's been going on, and to which they've made a few, they've also made a few blunders. There's been some bugs where data's being released and so on, so a few things where they're embarrassed. I think to a certain extent, there is a change afoot.
What is the standard that we should hold these companies to? How will we know that when they are actually, as you say, taking into consideration humanity at large and really combating hate speech? I mean, how will we be able to measure that? Will we have to just take it on good faith that they're saying they're doing it, or?
Oh, I think, well, to a certain extent, it's hard, but you need to do good science. So we call these people web scientists. They use all kinds of tools and complicated math to look at and look at it and then measure it. And then you have to decide, we as a community have to decide what do we think is important. Maybe we decide that it's important that this should be a good platform for democracy. We should look at different elections. Did those elections actually happen in a spirit of truth and in a spirit of open, respectable debate? And if they did, and so then we should give points on this metric.
Well, at the moment, if anything, we're seeing just the opposite. I mean, we've seen elections in Indonesia, here in Asia, as well as in India, and in both instances where there were accusations of many of the social media platforms, in fact, not stepping in quickly enough to close down sites that were obviously done by trolls aimed at slamming particular candidates.
Well, this is true, but it wasn't the question. The question was, if they do change their platforms, do we have a way of measuring it? And so I'm saying, yes, we can make ways of measuring it. But also, of course, the public may move with their feet. Initially, all the people who joined Facebook came from MySpace and Friendster, and they came because they could move over. If Facebook became, for example, instantly uncool, even though it's so huge and even though they have such a huge capital, they all know that could happen very quickly.
Do you think that putting in perhaps a pay system, in other words, at the moment when we search on Google, it's for free, so to say, we get the ads pushed to us, but we seem to accept that. Is it our fault as well that perhaps what we ought to be doing is we ought to be paying every time that we search on Google? We'd think a little bit more about what we searched for?
Well, first of all, there's two things that you should be doing as an individual. One is yes, you should be trying to behave. You should actually think before you retweet something. Think before you pass something on. Try to, even though it is something which gets you mad, is it really true? I don't think it is that everybody should be, suddenly we should take away everything that's free and put in everything that's, and charge for it. However, I did notice that after the elections, when fake news became an issue, a lot of the people I knew decided they very deliberately bought newspaper subscriptions. And they did that saying, I want to know that my money is paying for somebody who is working for me to produce the truth.
So back to mainstream media?
But also apps. I want the app to work for me. I want to be back to the days when we used to have PCs and floppy disks, and you bought a program at the computer store and you put it in your floppy disk, and you paid good money for the program, and it worked for you. So a lot of people, I think, if we can make a world where programs work for you again, they would subsidize it.
But that works in developed countries. For underdeveloped countries, that may actually be a hindrance. One of the fantastic things about the fact that things on the web are free is that you could argue it has democratized things, because it means that even very, very poor people who have access to the web can access a lot of its available information without having to pay and without having to go and have that floppy disk and pay for it. They just need to have a Wi-Fi connection. So
right.
Isn't there a negative aspect to that?
Well,
so paying specifically for it?
There is certainly a danger that you end up with a two-tier world in which, if you like, the intellectual elite can just make sure that no ads come into their houses and their children grow up believing that there's not realizing that ads are a thing. And the poorer people, as you say, they're completely manipulated by ads, and all the information that they read is a terrible quality. What can help us out of that situation? Well, to a certain extent, of course, things like if the full pay things, to a certain extent, if there's a certain amount of subsidy. So, for example, things like The Guardian when the people who pay for it, the New York Times, the people who pay for it subsidize the people who don't pay for it.
Do you ever regret inventing the web?
Well,
all of this sounds like a lot of work. It sounds like a lot of having to think about being on the web, rather than the sort of easy, free-flowing, immediate gratification thing that we think of as the web being now. All of yours requires a lot of reflection, Sir Tim. Are people really interested in going through that much thinking when using the web?
it requires reflection when we think about how to build it. If we do that reflection right, if the developers who are involved with the design of it now do that reflection right, then they will build a world which is just as easy for the users to get on with it.
If you were to go out on the street now with a placard concerning the web, what would it say?
Well, last time I went out on the street and the placard I was thinking it was in US protesting science, that science was a thing where there were attacks on science. So every now and again, good for the public to be able to express their opinions. In America at the moment, for example, the Trump administration has famously rolled back net neutrality. It's not as though companies are violating net neutrality hugely, but that's something, the fact that you can talk, when you connect to the internet, you can connect to anybody without, and your internet service provider can't discriminate. That's something we've always had to fight for. I think I would protest against censorship, against discrimination. But then when it comes to free speech and hate speech, then it's not so simple as just making a banner. Because you can't just say free speech and no hate speech.
Exactly, because
it's more complicated.
Exactly.
So in those cases, we have to sit down. And that's what the contract for the web is about. It's about sitting down and figuring out in our community when we have these values which seem to be in conflict, where are we going to draw the line? How are we going to build the social systems? How is a social network going to deal with an argument about hate speech?
But the people who end up sitting down, won't they still be the persons of influence and power? Persons like yourself. It won't really be your average teenage user or the grandmother who uses Instagram to share things with her children and her grandchildren in another country. It will still end up being a limited number of persons making decisions for billions.
Yes, that's the way decisions get made. But when people sit down around a table, if there is chanting outside, it does make a difference. Also, sitting around the table, we also have non-profits. We have NGOs. And the NGOs are driven largely, a lot of the energy in an NGO is young people. It's sort of younger demographic typically than the government, depending on the country. And so to a certain extent, NGOs are your friend. They will bring in the voices of the young, passionate people who will join the NGO because they're passionate about these.
How far are we in fixing all of these problems, these bugs?
I think we are in the early days. We've realized with a lot of the things that the Web Foundation has done over the last year or two is to a certain extent take stock and realize some of the ways in things need to be fixed. The contract for the web is an agenda. You know, it's not a final state. It's just a list of things where we need to work. There will be in the short-term discussion over different regulations in different countries, hopefully coming together. In the short term, maybe people finding tricks to the way they can tune their their social nets. In the medium term, then building perhaps new social networking sites which have got better, more pro-human characteristics. And then in the long term, research which really starts to understand how people interact, and so in the long term, what I would like to see is Just as we have a Wikipedia, which we tend to go to when we want truth, we should have a wiki democracy, which we can go to so that we know from experience that it's a really good place to have a debate. And you and I, if we have a big argument, we know that if we go to wiki democracy or whatever it's called, that we will be able to have that argument out and arrive at the best thing to do. So,
but we slug it out in a peaceful way.
But we do it in a respectful way.
Yes.
And in a way in which the things which are not true are eliminated from the discussion and so on. So yeah, so I think building tools for democracy on top of the web is a really important thing to do.
On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being terribly evil and 10 being terribly good, where do you think we are on the web now?
I think I feel that we're at sort of 6. I think that we've come up. We were
not terribly
we were
evil.
shooting for 10.
Right.
We thought we were going to go for, we thought, wow, we'll get 11 or 12. But then we're not. We're just marginally. With all really serious things to worry about. But on the other hand, also the benefits of the web. Don't forget the actual benefit. There are people. It's saving lives out there. It's bringing people together who fall in love and have a wonderful time. And so people, to a certain extent, there are lots of things which are functioning. There's a lot of commerce functioning. So there are lots of good things, and we mustn't forget those. And as we try to fix the bad things, like the fake news and like the nasty discussions, we must also remember to keep the good things.
Do you ever regret inventing the web?
Well, I've got a big switch back at the lab. So if I do, I can turn it off.
So Tim, thank you very much for being on In Conversation.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much for having me.